The pregnancy test fell from Isabelle's trembling fingers, clattering against the marble floor of the bathroom she'd called home for 2 years. 8 weeks pregnant. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more devastating. Downstairs she could hear Anthony's voice raised in anger, Soraya's sultry laugh echoing through their penthouse like poison. "She's been selling our secrets to the feds, Amor. I have proof." Isabelle's heart shattered as she heard her husband's sharp intake of breath. After tonight, she would either be celebrating the news of their first child together, or she would be dead. Because Anthony Romano had never shown mercy to traitors, and thanks to his mistress's lies, he now believed his pregnant wife was the greatest betrayer of all. But what neither Anthony nor Soraya knew was that Isabelle had been keeping a secret that would change everything, if she lived long enough to reveal it. You're about to witness a story of deception, betrayal, and shocking truths that will keep you glued to every word. As we work toward reaching 3,000 subscribers, your support means everything to us. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which part of this story grabs you the most. Now let's dive into this emotional roller coaster together. 6 months earlier, Isabelle Romano had thought she was living a fairy tale. Married to one of Chicago's most powerful men, she lived in a world of luxury that still felt surreal after 2 years. The penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, the designer clothes, the staff who anticipated her every need. It was everything a girl from the South Side could never have imagined. But lately, the fairy tale was turning into a nightmare. It started with little things. Anthony coming home later and later, his phone calls becoming more secretive, the way his expression would change whenever Soraya entered the room. His personal assistant had been with his organization for 3 years, a stunning Brazilian woman whose efficiency was matched only by her ability to make Isabelle feel invisible in her own home. "Mrs. Romano," Soraya had said just that morning, her accent making even respectful words sound condescending. "Anthony asked me to remind you about the charity gala tonight. He wants you to wear the red dress, the one that flatters your figure." The way she'd said "flatters your figure" made it sound like Isabelle needed all the help she could get. At 26, Isabelle was still the same woman Anthony had fallen in love with in the emergency room 3 years ago. But lately, she felt like a stranger in her own life. "Of course," Isabelle had replied, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Soraya." "De nada, querida," Soraya had purred, before gliding away in her impossibly high heels. That evening, as Isabelle prepared for the gala, she caught sight of herself in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. The red dress was beautiful, but her eyes looked hollow, haunted. When had she started looking so fragile? "You look stunning," Anthony's voice came from behind her, but when she turned, he was looking at his phone instead of her. "Anthony, can we talk?" "After the gala, Amor. Right now I need to handle some business." He kissed her forehead absently and disappeared into his study. The gala was held at the Palmer House Hotel. Chicago's elite gathered for another charitable cause that would raise millions of dollars in a single evening. Isabelle moved through the crowd like a ghost, smiling and making conversation while feeling utterly alone. "Mrs. Romano," a man's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see someone she didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed, but with kind eyes. "Yes? My name is David Mitchell. I'm with the FBI. Isabelle's blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, what?" "Please don't be alarmed. I'm here unofficially tonight as a guest. But I wanted you to know that if you ever need to talk, to share information, we can protect you." "I don't know what you're talking about." David handed her a business card disguised as a charity pamphlet. "Your husband is involved in activities that could destroy a lot of innocent lives, Mrs. Romano. If you want to help stop that, call me." Isabelle stared at the card, her mind reeling. "You think I would betray my husband? I think you're a good person who married a complicated man, and I think you might be the key to preventing a war that will get dozens of people killed." Before Isabelle could respond, David melted back into the crowd, leaving her standing there with his card burning in her hand like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. Talking to interesting people. Soraya appeared at her elbow as if from nowhere. "Just a charity representative," Isabelle said quickly, slipping the card into her purse. Soraya's dark eyes missed nothing. "Anthony is looking for you. He's ready to go home." The ride back to the penthouse was silent, Anthony lost in thought while Isabelle stared out at the Chicago skyline and wondered how her life had become so complicated. She'd never wanted to know about Anthony's business, had actively avoided learning details that might put her in danger. Now, apparently, that ignorance was no longer protection. "Anthony," she said as they entered their bedroom, "that man at the gala." "What man?" His voice was sharp, immediately alert. "Someone from the charity." He was asking about donations, but something felt off. Anthony's eyes hardened. What did he want exactly? He said something about preventing innocent people from getting hurt. It was strange. Did he give you anything? A card? A pamphlet? Isabelle hesitated. Something in Anthony's tone made her nervous about mentioning David Mitchell's card. "No, nothing like that." Anthony studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "If anyone approaches you again, anyone at all asking questions about me or our life, you tell me immediately. Understood?" "Of course." But as Anthony disappeared into the bathroom, Isabelle pulled David Mitchell's card from her purse and stared at it. On the surface, it looked like a charity pamphlet, but when she held it up to the light, she could see a phone number printed in invisible ink. What did the FBI want with her? And why did the thought of calling that number feel both terrifying and necessary? Over the next few weeks, Isabelle became increasingly aware of how much she didn't know about her own life. Anthony's conversations with Soraya became more frequent and more intimate. She would find them in his study, with documents spread across his desk, their heads bent close together as they discussed things in hushed tones. "It's just business, Amor," Anthony would say whenever she asked what they were working on. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Isabelle was worried. She was worried about the way Soraya looked at Anthony when she thought no one was watching. She was worried about the armed men who now accompanied Anthony everywhere, even to dinner. She was worried about the phone calls that came at all hours of the night, sending Anthony racing out of their home without explanation. Most of all, she was worried about the growing distance between her and the man she'd fallen in love with. "Mrs. Romano." The voice came from behind her as she left the grocery store one afternoon. She turned to see a young woman with auburn hair and worried eyes. "Yes? My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a federal prosecutor. Agent Mitchell asked me to make contact." I told him I wasn't interested. "Mrs. Romano, your husband is planning something that will result in dozens of deaths. A war between the Romano and Vitelli organizations that will turn Chicago into a battlefield." Isabelle stared at the woman. "That's impossible. Anthony would never—" 3 weeks ago, someone started feeding information to both families, convincing each side that the other was planning an attack. Soon, they'll have no choice but to strike first to survive. "What does this have to do with me?" Sarah Chen pulled out a tablet and showed Isabelle a series of photographs. "These calls originated from your home phone, all of them made while your husband was out of the house. All of them containing detailed intelligence about Romano family operations." Isabelle's knees nearly buckled as she stared at phone records showing her own number making calls to numbers she'd never seen before. "This is impossible. I never made these calls." "We know you didn't, Mrs. Romano, but someone with access to your home did. Someone who wants both organizations to destroy each other so they can step in and take control of everything." "Who?" "We have our suspicions, but we need proof. We need someone inside the Romano organization who can help us identify the real traitor before it's too late." Isabelle thought about David Mitchell's words at the gala, about preventing innocent people from getting hurt. "What would I have to do?" "Just observe. Listen. If you hear anything about planned attacks or see anything suspicious, call us. We're not asking you to betray your husband, Mrs. Romano. We're asking you to help save him from walking into a trap." That night, as Isabelle lay in bed beside Anthony, she thought about the federal agent's words. Someone was using her phone line to start a war. Someone with access to her home, her personal information, her most private spaces. Someone who wanted Anthony to believe his wife was the traitor. As if summoned by her thoughts, Anthony's phone rang. He answered on the first ring, his voice immediately alert. "What do you have for me, Soraya?" Isabelle's blood ran cold. Why was Soraya calling Anthony at midnight? And why did she sound like she was crying? "Slow down," Anthony said, sitting up in bed. "Someone broke into your apartment. Are you hurt?" Isabelle listened as Anthony arranged for Soraya to come to their penthouse for safety. Within an hour, his assistant was in their living room, tears streaming down her face as she described a terrifying break-in that had left her too frightened to stay alone. "You can take the guest room," Anthony said gently. "You'll be safe here." As Soraya settled into their home, Isabelle couldn't shake the feeling that this was all somehow part of a larger plan, but when she looked at the other woman's tear-streaked face and obvious terror, she felt guilty for her suspicions. Maybe she was becoming paranoid. Maybe the stress of living in Anthony's world was finally getting to her. Or maybe her instincts were trying to warn her about something her conscious mind wasn't ready to accept. 3 days later, Isabelle discovered she was pregnant. The timing felt like a cruel joke. Just as her marriage was becoming more strained, just as federal agents were asking her to spy on her husband, just as another woman was living in their home, she was carrying Anthony's child. She stared at the pregnancy test in her hand and wondered if she was bringing a baby into a world that was about to explode into violence. "Isabelle," Anthony's voice came from the bedroom. "Everything okay in there?" "Fine," she called back, quickly hiding the test in her makeup drawer, just getting ready for bed. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman who was running out of time. The federal agents wanted answers. Anthony needed to know about the baby, and Soraya was sleeping just down the hall, close enough to hear every conversation, every argument, every intimate moment between husband and wife. Something was very wrong in her life, and Isabelle was beginning to suspect that the danger wasn't coming from outside their home. It was already inside. Living with Soraya in their home was like having a beautiful snake coiled in the corner of every room. She was helpful, efficient, and constantly available to anticipate Anthony's needs in ways that made Isabelle feel redundant in her own marriage. "Anthony, Cara," Soraya would say, bringing him coffee exactly how he liked it before he even asked. "The meeting with the Torino representatives has been moved to Thursday." The casual endearment, the intimate knowledge of his preferences, the way she seemed to know more about Anthony's schedule than his own wife did, it all created a constant low-level anxiety that had Isabelle questioning her own sanity. 2 weeks after discovering her pregnancy, Isabelle still hadn't told Anthony. Every time she tried to find the right moment, Soraya would appear with some urgent business matter, or Anthony would get a call that sent him rushing out of the house. "Mrs. Romano," Sarah Chen's voice came through the burner phone the FBI had given her. "We need to meet, there's been a development." They met in the parking garage of Northwestern Hospital, the irony not lost on Isabelle that she was meeting federal agents in the place where she'd once worked as a nurse, back when her biggest worry was paying rent on her studio apartment. "Someone attacked a Vitelli family shipment last night," Sarah said without preamble. 3 men dead, millions in merchandise stolen. The Vitellis are convinced the Romano organization was responsible. Was it Anthony's people? No. But whoever did it used intelligence that could only have come from inside the Romano organization. Shipment times, routes, security details, information that only a handful of people would have access to. Isabelle felt sick. "And you think someone in Anthony's inner circle is feeding information to start this war?" "We know someone is. The question is whether your husband is aware of the betrayal or if he's being manipulated like everyone else. Anthony would never authorize an attack that would start a war. He's always said that open conflict is bad for business. Then someone is playing him, using his organization's resources, while keeping him in the dark." Sarah pulled out another tablet. "We've been monitoring phone traffic from your building. These calls were made from the penthouse level yesterday, just hours before the attack." Isabelle stared at the phone records. The calls had been made during the narrow window when Anthony was at a business dinner, and she was at her doctor's appointment for the pregnancy. The only other person in the penthouse would have been "Soraya," she whispered. "Your husband's assistant has access to everything. His files, his contacts, his security codes. If someone wanted to manipulate events from inside the organization, she would be perfectly positioned. But why would she do it? Anthony trusts her completely. She has a good job, security, access to his world. Why risk everything to start a war?" "Maybe because she's not working for herself," Sarah said grimly. "Maybe someone else is pulling her strings, someone who stands to gain from seeing both the Romano and Vitelli organizations destroy each other." Isabelle's mind raced. "What do you need me to do?" "We need proof of her involvement. Audio recordings, documents, anything that proves she's been feeding intelligence to outside sources. And if I can't get proof, then in less than a week, Chicago is going to become a war zone. The Vitellis are already mobilizing for retaliation. Your husband will have no choice but to respond with force. And once that starts..." Sarah didn't need to finish the sentence. That evening, Isabelle returned home to find Anthony and Soraya in his study, their conversation intense and urgent. Can't be a coincidence. Anthony was saying. 3 hits in 2 days, all of them targeting our most secure operations. Someone is feeding them information, Soraya replied, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. Someone close to us. Someone who knows our protocols. Isabelle stood in the doorway, watching her husband's face grow darker with each word. Is everything okay? Anthony looked up, and for a moment, she saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. Suspicion, not of Soraya, but of her. Just business troubles, he said carefully. Nothing for you to worry about. Anthony, if something's wrong, I want to help. The best way you can help, Soraya interrupted gently, is by staying out of dangerous situations. These are complicated times. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Isabelle was being shut out of her husband's crisis, relegated to the role of fragile wife who couldn't be trusted with important information. Of course, Isabelle said quietly. I'll be upstairs if you need me. As she climbed the stairs, she could hear Soraya's voice, soft and soothing. She's been acting strangely lately, hasn't she? More secretive, asking more questions about your business. Isabelle's hand froze on the banister. Soraya was planting seeds of suspicion about her, slowly poisoning Anthony's mind against his own wife. Isabelle's always been curious. Anthony's voice was defensive, but there was uncertainty in it. She just worries about me. Of course she does. I just think perhaps it would be wise to be more careful about what conversations happen where she might overhear them. The implication was clear. Isabelle couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. Her own husband was being convinced to treat her like a security risk. That night, as Anthony slept beside her, Isabelle stared at the ceiling and realized she was completely alone. The federal agents wanted her to spy on her husband. Anthony was beginning to see her as a threat, and Soraya was orchestrating it all with surgical precision. She placed her hand on her still flat stomach and whispered a promise to her unborn child. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to protect all of us, whatever it takes. The next morning, Isabelle made a decision that would either save her marriage or destroy it completely. She was going to find proof of Soraya's betrayal, even if it meant betraying Anthony's trust to do it. While Anthony was at a business meeting and Soraya was running errands, Isabelle used the security code she'd memorized to enter Anthony's study. His computer was password protected, but she knew Anthony well enough to guess the combination: their wedding date. The files she found made her blood run cold. Detailed plans for retaliation against the Vitelli family, shipping schedules for sensitive cargo, security protocols for their most important operations. Everything an enemy would need to destroy the Romano organization from within, but what terrified her most were the files labeled with her own name. Isabelle Romano, security assessment, contained a detailed analysis of her daily routine, her personal relationships, her access to Anthony's private information. According to the document, she was considered a potential intelligence leak due to her civilian background and possible federal contacts. Someone had been building a case against her for months, documenting every time she asked about Anthony's business, every phone call she made, every time she left the house without accounting for her whereabouts. The final entry in the file was dated yesterday. Subject may be compromised. Recommend immediate isolation and interrogation. Isabelle's hands shook as she photographed the documents with the phone Sarah Chen had given her. Anthony wasn't just suspicious of her. Someone had convinced him she was an active threat to his organization. Finding everything you need? Isabelle spun around to find Soraya standing in the doorway, her expression no longer the helpful assistant, but something cold and calculating. I was looking for a pen, Isabelle said weakly. In Anthony's computer files. Soraya stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. I don't think so, querida. The endearment sounded like a curse. Isabelle backed against the desk, her heart pounding. You know, I almost admired your persistence, Soraya continued conversationally. Even as Anthony began to suspect you, you kept trying to prove your innocence. It was quite touching. You're the one feeding information to the Vitellis. You're the one trying to start a war. Am I? Soraya smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Isabelle had ever seen. Or am I just a loyal assistant who discovered her boss's wife was selling secrets to federal agents? That's not true. Isn't it? Then what's this? Soraya pulled out a phone and played a recording. Isabelle's voice filled the room. I need more time. Anthony doesn't suspect anything yet, but if he finds out about our arrangement, we're both dead. The voice was hers, but the words weren't. Somehow Soraya had created a conversation that never happened, using clips of Isabelle's voice to manufacture evidence of betrayal. Voice synthesis technology is remarkable these days, Soraya said casually. A few hours of recorded conversations, and you can make anyone say anything. Anthony will never believe, won't he? His wife, asking suspicious questions, meeting with strangers at public events, making unexplained phone calls. And now I've caught you going through his private files. Soraya shook her head sadly. Poor Anthony. He loved you so much and you broke his heart. Isabelle realized with growing horror that she'd walked into a trap. By trying to find evidence against Soraya, she'd given the other woman exactly what she needed to destroy her. Why? She whispered. Why do this? Because Anthony Romano represents the old way of doing business. Honor codes, family loyalty, avoiding unnecessary violence. There are people who want a new kind of leadership in Chicago. Someone more flexible in their methods. Who? You'll never live long enough for that to matter, Soraya said, pulling a gun from her purse. But don't worry, querida. Your death will serve a greater purpose. When Anthony finds your body next to evidence of your federal cooperation, it will push him over the edge. The war with the Vitellis will become personal, and both organizations will tear each other apart. Anthony will never forgive himself if he kills his own wife. Oh, but he won't be the one to kill you, Soraya smiled again. The Vitellis will. At least that's what the evidence will show. Anthony will find you dead with a note confessing your betrayal and explaining that you tried to back out of your deal. The Vitellis killed you to keep you quiet. Isabelle's mind raced, looking for any way out. Soraya, I'm pregnant. The other woman's smile faltered for just a moment. What? I'm 8 weeks pregnant with Anthony's child. If you kill me, you'll be killing an innocent baby. For a heartbeat, Isabelle thought she saw uncertainty in Soraya's eyes. Then the cold calculation returned. Even better, she said softly. When Anthony learns he lost both his wife and his unborn child because of his enemies, he'll become exactly the kind of leader we need. Ruthless, vengeful, destructive. Isabelle closed her eyes and prepared to die, thinking of the pregnancy test hidden in her makeup drawer, of the life growing inside her that would never know its father's love. That's when she heard Anthony's voice from downstairs calling her name. He'd come home early. Isabelle, Soraya, where is everyone? Anthony's voice echoed through the penthouse, and Isabelle saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Soraya's face. They weren't supposed to be caught like this. Soraya needed time to stage the scene properly, to plant the evidence and create the narrative that would convince Anthony his wife had betrayed him. Answer him, Soraya whispered, the gun steady in her hands. Tell him you're working in here. Act normal or I'll shoot you and claim you attacked me when I discovered your treachery. Anthony, Isabelle called out, her voice surprisingly steady. We're in your study. Soraya was helping me find some documents. I'll be right up, came the reply. Soraya's eyes were calculating, adapting to the changed circumstances. When he comes in, you're going to confess everything. You'll tell him about your meetings with federal agents, about the information you've been passing along. Make it convincing or I'll put a bullet in him too, and claim the Vitellis infiltrated our home. Footsteps on the stairs. Anthony was coming, and Isabelle realized this might be her only chance to save both their lives. She thought about the pregnancy, about the future they could have if she could just find a way to expose Soraya's lies. Anthony, she called out suddenly. Don't come in here, it's a trap. Soraya's face contorted with rage. You stupid. The study door burst open, and Anthony appeared with his gun drawn, his eyes immediately taking in the scene, his wife backed against his desk, his trusted assistant pointing a weapon at her. Soraya? His voice was confused, disbelieving. What the hell is going on? Thank God you're here, Soraya said, her voice instantly transforming into distressed relief. I caught her going through your files. When I confronted her, she attacked me. I was defending myself. Anthony's eyes moved between the two women, his gun trained on Soraya but uncertainty clear in his expression. Isabelle? She's been setting me up, Anthony. She's the one feeding information to your enemies. She's the one trying to start a war between you and the Vitellis. She's lying, Soraya said desperately. Anthony, I have proof of her betrayal. Recordings, phone calls, evidence that she's been working with federal agents. Isabelle could see Anthony wavering, torn between his love for his wife and years of trust in his assistant. This was the moment everything would be decided. Anthony, she said softly. I'm pregnant. The words hit him like a physical blow. His gun hand dropped slightly as he stared at her. What? 8 weeks. I found out 2 weeks ago, but I couldn't find the right moment to tell you with everything that's been happening. His voice was barely a whisper. She's lying, Soraya interrupted harshly. It's a manipulation tactic. She knows she's been caught, so she's making up a pregnancy to gain sympathy. The test is upstairs in my makeup drawer, Isabelle said, never taking her eyes off Anthony's face. Top left drawer behind the foundation compact. I've been carrying it with me for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to share our happiness. Anthony's expression was a war between hope and suspicion. Soraya, lower the gun. Anthony, please think about this logically. She was going through your private files. She had no legitimate reason to be in here. Lower the gun. Soraya's facade was cracking, desperation creeping into her voice. She's been meeting with federal agents. I have recordings of her agreeing to spy on you. Show me, Anthony said quietly. Soraya fumbled with her phone, playing the synthesized recording of Isabelle's voice. But as the conversation played, Anthony's expression grew colder. That's interesting, he said when the recording finished. Because yesterday you told me that Isabelle said she needed more time to process everything when I asked her about starting a family. Those are the exact words you claimed she used. Isabelle felt a spark of hope. Anthony was analyzing the recording with the sharp intelligence that had made him one of Chicago's most successful leaders. I don't understand what you mean, Soraya said, but her voice was shaking now. The words "I need more time" appear in this recording, supposedly said to federal agents. But according to you, she said the same phrase to me about having children. Either you're lying about one of these conversations, or this recording has been doctored using pieces of conversations you overheard in our home. Soraya's gun hand was trembling now. Anthony, you have to believe me. I also find it interesting, Anthony continued, his voice deadly calm, that every piece of evidence against my wife comes from you. The suspicious phone calls you reported, the behavioral changes you noticed, the federal contacts you discovered. You've been the sole source of intelligence about Isabelle's alleged betrayal. Because I pay attention, because I care about protecting you, or because you're the actual traitor and you've been systematically building a case against my wife to cover your tracks. The accusation hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Soraya's mask finally fell away completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. You're making a mistake, Anthony, she said, her accent becoming thicker as her control slipped. I've been loyal to you for 3 years. I've given you everything. My expertise, my dedication, my body when you needed comfort. Isabelle felt like she'd been slapped. Anthony? It meant nothing, he said quickly, but she could see the guilt in his eyes. It was one night, months ago, when we thought we were losing everything. It was a mistake. Was it? Soraya laughed bitterly. Because you didn't seem to think it was a mistake when you told me you loved me. I never said that. No? Then what about this? Soraya pulled out her phone again and played another recording. This time it was unmistakably Anthony's voice. I love you. You mean everything to me. Isabelle's heart shattered as she heard her husband's voice declaring love for another woman. But Anthony was shaking his head. That's from the night I proposed to Isabelle, he said quietly. I called you to help me arrange the proposal dinner. You must have recorded that conversation and edited it. You're grasping at straws. Play it again, Anthony ordered. But this time listen to the background noise. Soraya played the recording again, and this time Isabelle could hear it too. The distinctive sound of the fountain in Millennium Park. Anthony had proposed to her there on a rainy evening in April. You recorded a conversation where I was talking about my wife, Anthony said, his voice filled with disgust. You took words meant for her and tried to use them to manipulate me. Soraya's composure finally cracked completely. She doesn't deserve you, she screamed. She's weak, naive, useless. She doesn't understand your world, your power, what you could become, what I could become. Without her holding you back, you could be more than just another crime boss. You could control everything, the docks, the politicians, the entire city, but she makes you soft, makes you think about consequences and collateral damage. Anthony's eyes hardened as understanding dawned. Someone's been feeding you ideas, haven't they? Someone who wants me to become more aggressive, more violent. Who is it, Soraya? Who's really behind this? It doesn't matter now, she snarled, raising the gun toward Isabelle again. She's seen too much, heard too much. Even if you don't believe me about the federal agents, You can't let her live knowing what she knows. What she knows is that you're a traitor and a liar, Anthony said, his own gun now trained directly on Soraya. Drop the weapon now. If I'm going down, I'm taking her with me, Soraya said, her finger tightening on the trigger. That's when Isabelle remembered the documents she'd photographed, the evidence that could prove everything. Anthony, check your computer. Look at the file labeled with my name. Anthony kept his gun trained on Soraya while reaching for his computer mouse. The file opened, revealing the detailed surveillance report on Isabelle, complete with recommendations for her elimination. You've been building a case against my wife for months, he said, his voice deadly quiet, documenting her movements, analyzing her behavior, marking her as a security threat, because she is a threat. She's always been a threat to what we could accomplish together. We? Anthony's voice was ice. There is no we, Soraya, there never was. There could have been. If she hadn't been in the way, if you'd been able to see what I was offering you. Isabelle watched her husband's face as the full scope of Soraya's obsession became clear. The woman hadn't just been trying to eliminate her as a security risk. She'd been trying to eliminate her as competition for Anthony's affection. You never loved me, Anthony said, and it wasn't a question. You loved what you thought I could become. You wanted to mold me into some version of a leader that suited your ambitions. I wanted to help you reach your potential. You wanted to turn me into a monster. Soraya's face twisted with rage and desperation. She's made you weak. Before her, you would have done whatever was necessary to protect your interests. Before her, Anthony said quietly, I was becoming exactly the kind of man you wanted. Ruthless, paranoid, isolated. She saved me from that, Soraya. She made me remember what it means to love something more than power. Then you're both fools, Soraya spat, and you deserve what's coming. She started to turn the gun toward Isabelle again, but Anthony was faster. The single shot echoed through the study like thunder. Soraya fell to the floor, her gun clattering across the hardwood. She was alive but wounded, her hand pressed to her shoulder as blood seeped through her fingers. Call an ambulance, Anthony said to Isabelle, though he kept his gun trained on the fallen woman. And call the FBI. They're going to want to hear everything she has to say. As sirens wailed in the distance and Soraya was taken away in handcuffs, Anthony and Isabelle sat in their living room, finally alone together for the first time in weeks. I need to know about that night, Isabelle said quietly. The night you slept with her. Anthony's face was etched with pain. It was 6 months ago. You were visiting your sister in Milwaukee, and I'd just lost 3 men in a warehouse raid. I was drinking, feeling responsible for their deaths, and she was there. She listened, comforted me, made me feel less alone. Did you love her? I thought I cared about her, but compared to what I feel for you, he shook his head. It was selfishness, not love. I was hurting, and I made a terrible mistake. Isabelle placed her hand on her stomach. Can we get past this? All of it. Anthony knelt in front of her chair, his hands covering hers. Are we really going to have a baby? Yes. Then yes, he said firmly. We can get past anything, because I refuse to let Soraya's poison touch our family any more than it already has. As they held each other in the ruins of their old life, Isabelle realized that sometimes the greatest betrayals come from within, but so does the greatest strength to overcome them. The war Soraya had tried to orchestrate was over before it began, but the real battle, the fight to rebuild trust and create a safe future for their child, was just beginning. 3 days after Soraya's arrest, Isabelle stood in the kitchen making breakfast when Anthony appeared behind her, his reflection ghost-like in the window that overlooked Lake Michigan. She could feel the weight of unspoken words between them, the careful politeness that had replaced their easy intimacy since the truth came out. Agent Mitchell called, Anthony said quietly. They want to debrief us again this afternoon. Isabelle nodded without turning around. The FBI had been surprisingly gentle during their initial questioning, more interested in understanding how Soraya had manipulated the situation than in pursuing charges against Anthony's organization. Apparently stopping a gang war was worth more to them than another racketeering case. Isabelle, Anthony's voice was careful, we need to talk about what happens next. She finally turned to face him, studying the man she'd loved and married and nearly lost. The past few days had aged him, carved new lines around his eyes and added silver to his dark hair. What do you mean? I mean that Soraya was right about one thing. This world, my world, isn't safe for you or our baby. Maybe it's time to consider leaving Chicago, starting fresh somewhere else. The offer hung between them like a bridge to a different future. Isabelle could picture it, a small house in a quiet town, Anthony working a legitimate business, their child growing up without armed guards and bulletproof cars. "Is that what you want?" she asked. Anthony was quiet for a long moment. "What I want is irrelevant. What matters is keeping you and our baby alive. Anthony, look at me." She waited until his dark eyes met hers. "What do you want?" "I want to be the man you fell in love with in that emergency room," he said finally. "I want to be worthy of your trust again. I want to raise our child without them ever having to be afraid." "Then maybe we should consider it," Isabelle said carefully. "But Anthony, I need you to be honest with me about something. Anything. When you slept with Soraya, was it because you weren't happy with me? With our marriage?" Anthony closed the distance between them, his hands gentle on her face. "No, God, no. It was because I was drowning in guilt and self-hate, and I made the worst possible decision in a moment of weakness. It had nothing to do with you and everything to do with my own failures. But you didn't tell me about it, because I was ashamed, because I knew it would hurt you for no good reason, since it meant nothing to me, because I was a coward who couldn't face disappointing you." Isabelle studied his expression, looking for any trace of deception. All she saw was raw honesty and deep regret. "I forgive you," she said quietly. Anthony's eyes filled with tears. "How can you? After everything I put you through, everything I believed about you, because Soraya played us both perfectly. She identified our weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. You're not the first good man to be manipulated by someone with an agenda. But I should have trusted you. I should have known." "Yes, you should have," Isabelle agreed. "And I should have told you about the FBI contacts immediately, instead of trying to handle it alone. We both made mistakes that almost destroyed our marriage." Anthony pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in weeks, it felt right. Safe, like coming home. "So what do we do now?" he whispered into her hair. "We figure out how to rebuild. Together." That afternoon, Agent Mitchell and Sarah Chen sat across from them in the FBI field office, their expressions professionally neutral, but not unfriendly. "Soraya Marquez has agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence," Mitchell said. "What she's told us is illuminating." He opened a folder and spread several photographs across the table. Isabelle recognized some of the faces, men who had attended social events at their penthouse, business associates she'd met briefly at restaurants and galas. "The Torino Coalition," Mitchell continued, "named after Vincent Torino, Anthony's former lieutenant who disappeared 2 years ago after being expelled from your organization." Anthony's face darkened. "Vincent's alive." "Very much so, and very interested in revenge. He's been building a network of disgruntled former associates from various Chicago families, all united by their desire to see the established organizations burn." Sarah Chen leaned forward. "Soraya was recruited 18 months ago when she was visiting family in São Paulo. Torino's people identified her as having access to your inner circle and systematically turned her against you." "But why target my wife?" Anthony's voice was hard. "Why not just try to kill me directly?" "Because killing you would have made you a martyr," Mitchell explained. "Your organization would have regrouped under new leadership and continued operating. But destroying your marriage, turning you against your wife, making you believe she betrayed you, that would have broken something fundamental in your character." Isabelle felt sick as the scope of the manipulation became clear. They wanted to turn him into someone else. Exactly. Someone paranoid, isolated, vengeful. Someone who would make increasingly violent decisions that would destabilize the entire power structure in Chicago. Anthony stared at the photographs. "How many others are there?" "Torino's coalition has members in 6 different organizations across the city. They've been playing everyone against each other for months, feeding information and disinformation to create conflicts." "What happens now?" Isabelle asked. Mitchell and Chen exchanged glances. "That depends on you, Mr. Romano. We can offer you a deal. Full immunity for your cooperation in dismantling the Torino coalition. In exchange, you help us identify their other operatives and testify against Vincent Torino when we bring him to trial. And after that? After that, you're free to make your own choices about your future." Anthony was quiet for a long moment, his hand finding Isabelle's across the table. "What kind of timeline are we talking about?" 6 months, maybe 8. Long enough for us to build solid cases against the key players. And protection for my wife? Complete witness protection protocols, new identities, relocation assistance, whatever you need to stay safe. Anthony looked at Isabelle, a question in his eyes. It's your decision, she said quietly. But I think Vincent Torino has hurt enough innocent people. All right, Anthony said finally. We'll do it. As they walked out of the FBI building into the Chicago evening, Isabelle felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope for the future. Are you sure about this? She asked as they got into Anthony's car. I'm sure that I want our child to grow up in a world where people like Vincent Torino can't manipulate innocent people for revenge, Anthony replied. I'm sure that I want to be someone our baby can be proud of. And after it's over, after Vincent is in prison and we're free to choose our own future, Anthony started the car, but didn't put it in gear. Instead, he turned to look at her, his expression serious. I want to leave this world behind, Isabelle. All of it. I want to find some place quiet where we can raise our children and I can build something legitimate with my own hands. Children? Plural? Anthony smiled for the first time in days. Well, assuming you want more than one. Assuming you still want any of this with me at all. Isabelle reached over and took his hand. I want all of it. The quiet life, the children, the chance to be normal people who don't need bodyguards and bulletproof cars. It won't be easy. I don't know how to be anyone other than who I've been for the past 15 years. Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time. As Anthony drove them home through the streets of Chicago, Isabelle placed her hand on her still small bump and imagined a different future, a house with a white picket fence, Anthony coaching Little League baseball, family barbecues where the biggest worry was whether they'd remembered to buy enough hamburger buns. It seemed impossible, this normal life they were planning. But then again, 6 months ago, she never would have believed that her marriage could survive what they'd been through. Sometimes she realized the most extraordinary thing you could do was choose to be ordinary, to love simply, trust completely, and build a life based on truth instead of fear. And sometimes that was enough to save everything that mattered. 8 months later, Isabelle stood in the kitchen of a small house in Boulder, Colorado, watching her husband teach their 3-month-old daughter Isabella how to help him make pancakes. The baby was strapped to his chest in a carrier, her tiny hands waving as Anthony narrated his cooking process in the gentle voice she'd fallen in love with years ago in a Chicago emergency room. Now we add the vanilla, Principessa, he murmured to the baby. Just a little bit like your mama taught me. The man making pancakes on a Sunday morning bore little resemblance to the Anthony Romano who had once commanded a criminal empire. This Anthony wore jeans and a Colorado Buffaloes t-shirt. This Anthony's biggest concern was whether they needed more diapers, not whether rival families were planning attacks. This Anthony slept peacefully through the night instead of starting awake at every sound. The FBI called, Isabelle said, settling into a chair at their small kitchen table. Vincent Torino was sentenced yesterday, 25 to life. Anthony nodded without looking up from the pancakes. Good. Maybe now his victims' families can find some peace. The trial had been extensive, revealing the full scope of the Torino Coalition's activities, dozens of arrests across 6 cities, criminal enterprises dismantled, corruption exposed at every level. Anthony's testimony had been crucial, his insider knowledge helping federal prosecutors build ironclad cases. Agent Mitchell also said they've officially closed our file, Isabelle continued. We're free and clear. No more check-ins, no more protection details. This time Anthony did look up, something complicated crossing his expression. How do you feel about that? Relieved, scared, grateful. She paused. Free. They'd been living under modified witness protection for nearly a year, their old identities officially dead while they built new lives as Tony and Isabella Martinez, a young couple who'd moved to Colorado for Tony's job with a construction company. It had been surprisingly easy to disappear into suburban anonymity. Do you miss it? Isabelle asked quietly. The power, the respect, the excitement. Anthony was quiet for a moment, transferring pancakes to a plate. Sometimes I miss the feeling of being important, of having people depend on me for answers. But then, Isabella smiles at me. Or you laugh at something ridiculous on TV, and I remember that this is what actually matters. He unstrapped the baby carrier and handed their daughter to Isabelle before sitting down with breakfast. Isabella immediately tried to grab Isabelle's hair, her dark eyes, so much like her father's, bright with curiosity. "Dr. Peterson called too," Isabelle said, trying to keep Isabella's tiny fists away from her earrings. The test results came back. Anthony's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. They'd been trying for another baby for the past 3 months, and Isabelle had gotten blood work done earlier that week. "And? We're pregnant again," Isabelle smiled. "About 6 weeks along." Anthony's face broke into a grin so wide that Isabella gurgled and reached for his face. "Really? Really? Dr. Peterson says everything looks perfect so far." Anthony leaned across the small table to kiss her, careful not to disturb the baby between them. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "Both of you. All 3 of you now." "I love you too," Isabelle whispered back. "All of you. Even the parts that used to terrify me." As they ate breakfast together in their sunny kitchen, Isabelle thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment, the betrayal that had almost destroyed them, the violence that had nearly claimed their lives, the lies that had made them question everything they believed about each other. Soraya Marquez was serving 15 years in federal prison, her dreams of power and revenge reduced to appeals and parole hearings. Vincent Torino would likely die behind bars. The criminal empire Anthony had inherited from his father was gone, absorbed by other organizations or dismantled by federal investigations. And yet, somehow, this felt like winning. "Mama," Isabella babbled, her first almost word. "Did you hear that?" Anthony's voice was filled with wonder. "She's trying to say mama. She's 3 months old, Tony. It's just babbling." "No, she's brilliant, clearly advanced for her age." Anthony's expression was completely serious, making Isabelle laugh. "You're going to be one of those fathers, aren't you? The kind who thinks their child is a genius because they rolled over early." "Our child is exceptional in every way," Anthony said with mock solemnity. "Just like her mother." Later that evening, after Isabella was asleep and they were cuddled on the couch watching a mindless romantic comedy, Isabelle found herself studying Anthony's profile in the flickering light of the TV. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't figured out the truth about Soraya?" she asked quietly. Anthony was quiet for a moment. "I try not to think about that, but sometimes, in the middle of the night when I can't sleep, I imagine what my life would have been like if I'd killed you that night." Isabelle shivered. "You wouldn't have. Deep down, you knew the truth." "Did I? Because there were moments when I was so convinced of your betrayal that I planned exactly how I would do it. Soraya almost succeeded in turning me into someone capable of murdering my own wife. But you didn't. When it mattered most, you chose to listen instead of react. Only because you were brave enough to tell me about the pregnancy. If you hadn't said that—" "But I did," Isabelle interrupted firmly. "And you chose to believe me instead of her. That's what saved us." Anthony pulled her closer, his hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "I never want to be that man again. The man who could doubt you, even for a second. You won't be, because now we know what happens when we stop communicating, when we let fear make our decisions for us. Promise me something," Anthony said seriously. "Promise me that if you ever feel like I'm becoming someone you don't recognize, you'll fight for us. Even if it means challenging me, even if it means making me angry." "I promise," Isabelle said, "but only if you promise the same thing." "Deal." As they sat together in their small living room, surrounded by the ordinary domestic happiness they'd chosen over power and excitement, Isabelle realized that this was the greatest victory possible. Not the destruction of their enemies, or the accumulation of wealth and influence, but the simple ability to trust each other completely. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, dusting their small yard and the modest houses of their neighbors. In Chicago, the criminal underworld continued its endless cycles of betrayal and revenge. But here, in this small house in Colorado, Tony and Isabella Martinez were building something that no amount of manipulation could destroy, a family based on truth, forgiveness, and the radical decision to love each other without reservation. 6 months from now, they would welcome another baby into their quiet life. Their children would grow up knowing their parents as people who chose each other every single day, who built their happiness through honesty rather than deception. And somewhere in a federal prison, Soraya Marquez would spend her days regretting the family she'd tried to destroy, never understanding that love built on truth is stronger than any weapon, any lie, any betrayal. As Anthony carried a sleeping Isabelle to their bedroom, He whispered a prayer of gratitude for the second chance they'd been given. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, small domestic crises, and the ordinary struggles of raising children and building a legitimate life. But tonight, they were simply Tony and Isabella Martinez, a young couple expecting their second child, surrounded by the peace that comes from choosing love over fear, truth over deception, and each other over everything else the world had to offer. The war was over. The lies had been exposed, and the only battle that remained was the joyful struggle of creating a life worthy of the love they'd fought so hard to preserve. 5 years later, Isabella Martinez stood in the backyard of their larger house in the suburbs of Boulder, watching her husband push their daughter Isabella on the swing set while their son Michael played in the sandbox nearby. At 4 years old, Isabella had inherited her father's intensity and her mother's compassion, while 2-year-old Michael was pure sunshine and laughter. "Higher, Daddy," Isabella demanded, her dark curls flying. "Any higher and you'll fly away, Principessa." Tony laughed, but he pushed the swing a little harder. Isabella placed her hand on her rounded belly, where their third child was growing strong and healthy. This pregnancy had been easier than the others, perhaps because she was no longer carrying the weight of secrets and fear. "Mrs. Martinez," their neighbor Sarah called over the fence, "the adoption papers came through. We're officially Michael and Emma's parents." Isabella smiled warmly. The Hendersons had been trying to adopt for 3 years, and their joy was infectious. "Congratulations, we should celebrate. Barbecue this weekend?" "That sounds perfect." This was the life they'd built. Neighborhood barbecues, PTA meetings, little league games, and the comfortable routines of suburban parenthood. Tony now owned a successful construction company that employed 37 people and had never once bent a single law. Isabella worked part-time as a school nurse, using her medical training to help children instead of treating gunshot wounds in emergency rooms. "Mama, look!" Michael toddled over with a dandelion he'd picked from the grass. "Flower for baby." He placed the wilted flower gently on Isabella's belly, his small face serious with concentration. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, kissing his forehead. "I'm sure the baby loves it." "Baby sister?" Michael asked hopefully. He'd been asking for a sister for months, convinced that Isabella needed someone on her team to balance out the boys in the family. "We'll find out soon," Isabella promised. That evening, after the children were asleep and they were cleaning up the dinner dishes, Tony wrapped his arms around Isabella from behind, his hands resting on her pregnant belly. "Dr. Chen called today," he said quietly. "The baby's healthy. Everything looks perfect. And it's a girl." Isabella leaned back against his chest, smiling. "Michael's going to be so excited. He's been planning what to teach his sister for weeks. What should we name her?" They'd been discussing names for months without reaching a decision. Isabella had been named for Isabella's grandmother, and Michael for Tony's grandfather. This baby needed her own special meaning. "What about Hope?" Isabella suggested, "because she represents everything we hope for our future." Tony was quiet for a moment. "Hope Martinez. I like it." As they stood together in their kitchen, surrounded by evidence of their ordinary, extraordinary life, Isabella thought about the path that had brought them here, the betrayals that had nearly destroyed them, the lies that had made them doubt everything they thought they knew about love, the violence that had almost claimed their lives. All of it had led to this moment, a quiet evening in suburban Colorado, planning the name for their third child while their other children slept safely upstairs. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Leaving everything behind?" "Never," Tony said without hesitation. "This life, this family, this peace, it's worth more than any amount of power or money. Even when you're dealing with contractors who don't show up on time and customers who want to renegotiate after the work is finished." Tony laughed. "Even then, those problems have solutions that don't involve violence or moral compromise. I sleep better knowing that my biggest worry is whether we ordered enough lumber for the Henderson project." Isabella turned in his arms, studying the face that had become more handsome to her with each passing year. The lines around his eyes were from laughter now instead of stress. The silver in his hair spoke of quiet contentment rather than constant vigilance. "I love you, Tony Martinez," she said softly. "I love you too, Isabella Martinez," he replied, "forever and always." Outside their window, snow was beginning to fall again, blanketing their neighborhood in pristine white. In Chicago, the criminal underworld continued its endless dance of power and betrayal. But here in their small corner of Colorado, the Martinez family was living proof that sometimes the greatest victory is simply choosing to love each other without reservation, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what came before. Their children would grow up knowing their parents as people who chose truth over deception, love over fear, and each other over everything else the world had to offer. They would learn that real strength comes not from controlling others, but from building a life worth protecting. And somewhere, in the records of the Chicago Police Department, the files on Anthony Romano and Isabelle Romano remained closed, their subjects officially deceased. In their place lived Tony and Isabella Martinez, parents of 3 beautiful children, members of the Sunset Ridge Elementary PTA, and living proof that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is choose to be ordinary.